Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson with my introduction to this week's podcast. My conversation with Richard Rhodes, the author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb, about the future of rural America. This was his suggestion. I frankly was a little puzzled when he provided it, but I'm glad we had this conversation. I think it was an exceedingly rich one. He has a deep interest in rural life. He spent some formative years on an orphanage where he and his brother were placed for their safety after their domestic life shattered. He wanted to talk about how the plight of rural America fuels the sort of angry and polemical politics of our time. And I tried to pull away a little bit from this, but he sees Donald Trump as a sort of a false prophet, as he likens him to the Music Man, the famous movie and Broadway production, the musical, The Music Man, which is, by the way, a very great piece of Americana. At any rate, we talked about the Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies parts of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, and how it's almost spent. We talked about the coming of robotic agriculture, the virtue and value of being deeply connected to your own food supply. He's slaughtered some creatures. I've slaughtered a few myself. It's a bloody awful business, but there is something to it that is deeply invigorating and reconnecting to the basic processes of life. And my question was really Jefferson's question. Is rural life superior to other ways of living? We're now a really profoundly urban culture. In Jefferson's time, 95% of the American people were farmers. In our time, about 2%. So whatever Jefferson's agrarian utopian dream was, we are no longer living it. How important was that? Was Jefferson just mythologizing? After all, he was a large farmer of huge tobacco plantations operated by gangs of slaves from Africa and brought in chains across the Atlantic Ocean to work for other people, white people, who supervised but didn't get their hands very dirty. So was Jefferson's agrarian dream fallacious and hollow at the core, or was he onto something that we have decided to turn away from? Is there any return to rural America? My answer is probably not. His answer is probably not. Young people today want more from life, more economic opportunity and more amenities, more social life. The gene pool in rural Montana is small. The number of entertainments in that part of the world, if you exclude television, is small. There's greater mobility than ever before, but it's still very isolating to live on a farm 26 miles from town. No matter how good your broadband, there is a sense of sacrifice that young people today, in increasing numbers, are simply unwilling to commit to. And so I said that in my book, which I heartily recommend, by the way, The Language of Cottonwood's Essays on the Future of North Dakota, the hardest sentence that I ever had to push return on was this. It's not clear that the problems of rural America can be solved. And Richard Rhodes thinks that there will be some techno fixes, but as far as I'm concerned, the techno fixes are part of the problem. That however great they are in terms of the efficiency of food production, that's not agrarianism, that's not the small family farm, that's not the spiritual regeneration that comes from having your hands in the soil. And I suppose my own romance with the agrarian comes from two sources. My grandparents were small dairy farmers in western Minnesota, and my grandmother, Rhoda Strauss, is my hero. She had a garden that was half an acre in size, and she canned hundreds of quarts per year. She's my inspiration, and I have an image of her overlooking my kitchen and her rolling pin framed on the wall. And the other source was Jefferson, of course, the great agrarian visionary. And when he says, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, I hearken to it. I don't know if I entirely believe it, but I certainly hear the deep, wonderful, romantic poetry in that. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. And those two influences have had enormous impact on my adult consciousness. And my friends who grew up on real farms, who actually did chores and so on, say, get over it. We ain't going back, and it wasn't romantic at all. It was just sheer hard work. Towards the end of the program, I asked Richard Rhodes if he knows the work of Wendell Berry, and I was surprised that he said, just a little. But I would have thought that he and Wendell Berry were soul brothers in many respects, because they both are fascinated by what has gone wrong and how our politics has been distorted by this divide. The great mass of the American people live in urban environments, mostly on the coasts, and a few great city-states, Denver, Chicago, Houston. And I guess Houston is really a port city, isn't it? And that shows. And rural America, which is the great preponderant mass of America, is largely empty and emptying. And nobody can regard this as a good thing. And nobody's really addressing it, but at least Donald Trump, I will give him credit, said, I hear you. I hear your angst. I hear it. Now, his solutions to those problems don't seem to me to be the right ones, but that's not the question. Somebody finally heard Lee Greenwood's people, and that propelled Donald Trump into the presidency. And I don't think that we should be condescending about that at all. I think we should listen very carefully to that and try to learn from it, even if it rubs us the wrong way in some respects. Anyway, I just want to say how privileged and honored I am to be able to call Richard Rhodes my friend. We've really gotten to know each other a little bit. I've been reading his other books, some of which are astonishing. And of course, I return to the making of the atomic bomb with great frequency. He's an amazing man, and he's in advanced years now, but still writing every day, still thinking, still reading, still trying to figure out what John Steinbeck called this monster country. And so let's go to the show. But I think if you like what we're doing here, and I hope you do, we've gotten tremendous feedback for the recent program with Joseph Ellis on whether we're still a republic, and questions for, say, Richard Slotkin, who has this new book, and by the way, an article in the New York Times this week on American narrative and how the conservatives have a narrative and the left doesn't really have a narrative that it can promulgate with any confidence about what America is and what it represents and how we got here and where we're headed. So I'm trying to interview these extraordinary people, and thanks to the success of Listening to America, they are increasingly available to us. And if you can think of people that I should interview or get to know, I want to hear that. And if you can help make connections with some of them. For example, I very much want to interview Marianne Williamson. I know she's sort of pigeonholed as a New Age loony, but she's not. And I think she's on to the spiritual malaise of the United States. And I want to interview people about energy and about astronomy and about America's place in the world and so on and so forth. So if you can help by putting me in touch with people that would be fascinating subjects to talk about. And of course, if you can help in other ways. We need money to do the things that we're doing. Just to give you a quick update, I'm in Vail today. I'm going to be interviewing David Gregory tonight, the former moderator of Meet the Press. And then I'm going to Arches National Park and to Canyonlands National Park to see our friends Susan Ryan and Frank Lister, along with Dennis McKenna, my partner in the Listening to America initiatives. And then I'll be going to Winslow, Arizona to pick up Route 66 and resume now what will be Phase 3 of the 2024 John Steinbeck trek around the perimeter of the United States. I'm so glad you're along for the ride. Contribute in any ways that you can. We're revamping the website. We're revamping the 1776 Club to provide more and new content and more advantages. This is a growth period for us, and I truly am having the time of my life. So for the moment, hello everyone, and let's go to the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to Listening to America. One of my favorite people, one of my favorite guests is with me today, Richard Rhodes, the author of umpteen books, I think that's the correct technical term, including, of course, the famous The Making of the Atomic Bomb, but many, many others. I'm just so pleased that we have developed this relationship where we can talk about a range of subjects. And Richard, my fundamental interest, my biggest interest is America as we approach our 250th birthday. These are important anniversaries, as you know, the bicentennial. Here we are at 250. I participated in the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. When these moments come, it's important to step back and think about, well, where are we and how did we get here and what are the trend lines and how healthy is our Republican system of government and so on. And I think you're a perfect person to do that because you're a polymath and you've been all over the map with your books. So I want to do a program soon about where we are with respect to the nuclear world, which is a fascinating subject. But today, with your permission, let's talk about urban v. rural, coast v. heartland, whatever this phenomenon is, and I can tell you, I've been driving around the country for the past year, as you know, and I can tell you there's a lot of heartland. And most of the population is on the coasts, and the heartland is comparatively empty, with exceptions for Kansas City and St. Louis and so on. It's amazing how much heartland there is and how much it's considered flyover country. So welcome, Richard Rhodes.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just remembering when we moved from Connecticut to California 20 years ago. We drove, of course, because you have your favorite electronics that you have to carry with you, and in our case, a cat. By the way, started out the ride hiding in his litter box in the back of the SUV we were driving in. By the end of the trip, was up on the cushion right behind us, looking out the front window. So he really learned in the course of a 7-day drive. But we passed through what we call the I states, Illinois, Indiana, and so forth.
Iowa.
It just seemed like endless corn, which basically it was. Everybody grows corn, and there's a story behind that, of course. And they grow soybeans, and that's another part of the story. But the openness, not the openness, the barrenness, if you will, of life. But the other part of that is, of course, that there are empty farmhouses
Everywhere.
all over the middle of the country. A sign of just how much people have left the farm in the last 150 years. I'm writing a book right now that's set in the early 1900s. And by then, it was almost 50-50. Farm and city. And it was the influx of people into the cities that was causing many of the problems, public health problems and so forth, that the cities had to deal with, which is what I'm writing about. But I just saw a prediction in one of my science journals that by 2050, 70% of the American population will be living in cities. That means the other thing that I noticed in driving across the country, as I'm sure you have, is that all the fences are down. Farms used to be multi-operations where you raised cattle, you raised hogs, you raised chickens, you raised sheep, you grew corn, you grew maybe a little bit of soybeans, not much. Soybeans to us in 1950, when I lived on a farm, were a crop that we didn't really know what to do with. We were taught in high school agriculture classes that soybeans were kind of green manure, and that you grew them in the rows between the corn, and then you plowed them under because they're full of nitrogen. So there was a way of fertilizing the soil. The idea that we would be selling soybeans to the rest of the world to make soy sauce and all the other things had not yet occurred to anyone, or at least there was no market for it yet. So it was farms were multiple units where basically you grew the things that allowed you and maybe a certain amount of people whom you sold things to live comfortably on the farm. Now they're very much specialized places.
Yes, it's really a revolution in agriculture and therefore a revolution in rural life. My grandparents had a dairy farm in Minnesota of 80 acres, and a third was pasture. And then they'd have 12 to 15 acres of wheat and some oats because they at one time had horses. They had chickens, they had hogs, they had the steers that they were raising for the beef market, and some corn, not much. And every year they would plant 2 rows of sweet corn. I know you can identify with that template of what was American agriculture.
Right, and 80 acres was more than enough to support a thriving family, as obviously you know. Now, by contrast, after I published The Making of the Atomic Bomb, the editor of what was then a very large operation called the Book of the Month Club, which if you hit the jackpot of being a monthly selection, automatically made your book a bestseller. I never got to that point. But the editor said, you've got a farm background tucked away in there. How about you write a book about life on the farm today? And I'll guarantee it will be at least an alternate selection. Well, the club went out of business before we got there. But the point is, I had spent 5 years in my basement office in Kansas City, where I grew up and lived at the time, working on endless stacks of documents, writing, making the atomic bomb. And the idea that I would be going out onto a farm and working outdoors and doing all the wonderful things farmers do just won my heart. And I found a farmer in central Missouri who was willing to tolerate having what looked like a city person hang out with him. Free labor, to be sure, but mostly he liked World War II stories and said, I just finished a book about World War II. I was kind of his Scheherazade for those 9 months. We worked together every day, and it was so different. He farmed 1,000 acres, and that was about the minimum that you could live on. He made about, I think he told me once rather proudly, his income was about 110, 120,000 a year, which is a good income, more than adequate for someone who lives in rural Missouri, where the costs aren't so high.
1,000 acres is not enough in most places today. This is monoculture for the most part. It's all soybeans or corn or maybe milo, but it's not a diversified farm with a few acres of this and 150 acres of that. Fences get in the way. Shelter belts, one of the greatest achievements of the New Deal, are now being routinely bulldozed down because they simply get in the way.
Those are the trees that were planted during the great
Dust Bowl.
Yeah, the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. Well, I think Jim has passed away, unfortunately. He retired eventually, but I think it's up to around 2,000. He did have mostly a monoculture, but he did raise hogs, and he raised them in a big hog barn. We used to walk in there, and the smell, of course, is overwhelming. Jim would stop and say, Dick, that's the smell of money. So he did have that much animal culture, which was logical because there was a lot of corn around.
When I was growing up in North Dakota, in western North Dakota, there were these small towns like Mott and Hettinger and Stanley and Crosby, and they had about 2,500 people each. And they had a vibrant main street that was probably a quarter of a mile long, and there was a barber shop or two. There was a men's clothing store, a couple of women's frock stores. There would be a grocery store, of course, a couple of hardware stores, plenty of taverns and bars, a post office, etc. And they weren't exactly thriving, but they were doing well. And people shopped locally. They didn't travel that much in the 60s and early 70s. Now people in those same towns will drive 2.5 hours to a Costco or a Super Walmart. The local grocery store, if it exists at all, has wilted lettuce and third-rate tomatoes. You've been in these places. There's been a kind of a horrible shrinking and dissolution of small-town life, and it's not just on the Great Plains, it's everywhere, and it's not just in the United States, it's happening in Europe, too. People don't want to live in isolated rural places anymore, and the agricultural and ingenuity of our time means that they don't have to.
That's true. And yet I think many people would never have left if they'd been able to make a decent living. You know, your connection of hollowing out small towns with Walmarts takes me back to what I just came across in a science journal, an interesting paper looking at the connection between the introduction of center pivot irrigation systems into the high plains. They chose the high plains because there was data on that part of the country, but you could think about it all over the central part of the United States. Central pivot irrigation was a system that allowed people to grow much more valuable crops than what was available to them when they only had natural water supplies from rain, which is, of course, a very low level in the high plains. One of the reasons there aren't any trees there. You drill down to a deep aquifer. In this case, it was the Ogallala aquifer, which is now apparently almost drained dry, and it's going to be the next crisis for the Middle West. And run a pipe down and pump up using the system that made all this possible, which was deep pumping gasoline-powered engines. Pump up the water and attach it to this horizontal pipe on the surface that has holes in it for irrigation water to spray out. And this thing, which is about 100 feet long, is powered by the pressure of the water and rotates around in a big, big circle, easy to see from the air if you're in cross-country airliner. I remember seeing some once when I flew over Saudi Arabia, of all places. But they also had the problem of a lot of barren, dry land that they couldn't use. You know, California, before it introduced irrigation, and California's irrigation isn't center pivot, but it's a comparable transformation. California was primarily a place where the Central Valley, where you grew wheat. But then California discovered irrigation, and now is suddenly known to everyone as the truck farm, if you will, of America. Where we grow everything from nuts to oranges to all of the things that get shipped around the land. So this method of changing the use of the land is, I think, really interesting in terms of what happened to the political changes.
So, Richard, we need to take a short break. I'm talking with the great author, Richard Rhodes. We're talking about the heartland today and the hollowing out of the heartland. When we come back, I want to ask you a really important Jeffersonian question, and that is, why does this matter? You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. Richard Rhodes, you've been talking about center pivot irrigation. I lived on a farm on the Ogallala Aquifer for a few years. We had 9 miles of underground pipe, and then we had flood irrigation. And that means you carry those very heavy and hot pipes around in a wagon, and you connect them together like Legos or straws, and then you open little chutes, and they spill the water down the furrow. It's a very wasteful system of irrigation. But then everyone transformed into center pivot irrigation. And because that's also wasteful, taking cues from the Israelis, they've moved to drop nozzles, which get the water really down close to the ground. But whatever you do, you're taking water from an underground aquifer that was once the size of Lake Huron, the Ogallala, and as you said, it's running dry, and its life will end in the next 50 years, certainly in most places. There might be a few deep pockets, but that will be a collapse of the economy of western Kansas, western Nebraska, the panhandle of Texas, parts of Oklahoma, parts of eastern Colorado, even parts of South Dakota. And so that's going to be a very, very interesting transformation. But here's my question. We still have plenty of food in the stores. It's cheap food. It's on the whole good food. Does it matter that the Jeffersonian idea of the agrarian economy and these rugged individualists who are out there raising a few hogs and plucking a few chickens and growing some food, and in Jefferson's mind, they would be sort of subsistence plus. They'd be living the good life. They'd be absolutely politically independent. They would owe nothing to anybody. They would be able to feed themselves and clothe themselves and shelter themselves. They had many on-farm skills like welding and carpentry and wiring and stripping an engine and so on. And they were sort of Jefferson's ideal Americans. And they're mostly gone now. And in fact, my former wife, who grew up on that farm on the Ogallala, called my grandparents' farm a farmy farm. Like a little farmy farm, like almost like a hobby, It always really upset me when she would say that, but I can see from her perspective why that might be so. So the question I have for you is, does this matter? Because most Americans are consumers of food. They go into the supermarket, they find what they want. They don't really care where it comes from. They hope that it's reasonably healthy, but they're not scrupulous about these things. And if that hollows out western North Dakota or parts of Iowa, who cares?
Well, and that's what this article in the journal Science was so interesting about, because, with the introduction of this very large-scale way of producing crops came agribusiness, basically. That's when agribusiness really began replacing the family farm. And with agribusiness came a population of people who were conservative politically. They were businessmen, and they were more interested in the business side of politics than in the rest. And I think a lot of what is going on in terms of the hollowing out of small towns and the appearance of superstores probably has had the same effect. Whether you value that perspective or not, ultimately it's a real challenge to the traditional Jeffersonian view of America. And the increasing divide, which you mentioned earlier, between city and country. If we get into that, it turns out that's one of the most ancient divisions in humanity's history. You could go all the way back to the Greeks and find debates.
Or Mesopotamia, for that matter.
Oh, yeah, and find debates about whether it's better to be a city person or a country person. And inevitably, the city people, from the country person's point of view, are considered corrupt. And the country people, from the city person's point of view, are considered hicks, idiots, stupid, and so forth. That's a universal. Where that came from, I can't say. I have no idea. But it's a very interesting phenomenon that it has been around forever. I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah are just a classic example.
Cities.
of corruption in the cities, so I don't know what to say about it. I'm just fascinated by it and saddened by it because I've lived in both places. I grew up until I was 12, wandering around Kansas City, Missouri with no supervision. We lived that way in those days. My mother had died when I was 13 months old, and I had basically been raised in a boarding house, and my father worked for the railroad and a roundhouse fixing steam engines 6 days a week. So I was in the hands of my older brother, whose favorite name for me was "You Big Baby." And so we didn't spend a lot of time together. We did, actually. He was my guardian and my angel. But I got to wander around a middle-sized American city and just watch everyone doing everything people do, and with the intelligence, happily, of a smart kid. And the place I tended to play was the city junkyard, which was wide open. I could go in there and take apart old refrigerators or whatever happened to be lying about, and had a really good sense of the machine side of human life, if you will. But then when I was 12, as the result of a stepmother out of the Grimm's fairy tales, I was fortunately removed from the family home and sent to a boys' home with my brother, which was a working farm. It was 360 acres, quarter of a square mile, that supported 40 boys and the whole staff of the place, and even had a little bit left over to make a little money on the side.
So Jefferson believed, a little bit in a literary, mythological fashion, to be sure, that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, that the family farm was the center of what a small R republic would be. And he said, as long as the great majority of us are farmers, we will be the freest and happiest and most independent people in history. And the moment we begin to crowd into cities. So he was mouthing that very anti-urban myth that you were talking about a little while ago, that's as old as humanity. But he actually believed that we had to be a nation of small holders if we were going to be a happy and independent nation, and we're not. My friend who lives in the central part of North Dakota and her husband just bought a new combine for $700,000, a new tractor with all the GPS gadgets, and it runs itself effectively. It has everything but a hot tub in the cab. That's $700,000. So this necessitates industrial gigantism. You can't make that machinery work on a 200 or 400 or 600 acre farm. You need thousands of acres to make that cash flow, which means you're going to lease land from your neighbors when that land becomes available, that we get larger and larger and larger. And Richard, as you know, we're just getting started here because we're now entering the AI robotic era of drone farming, and you will be able to be living in Honolulu and run a farm in Minnesota with your computer.
Yeah. Well, and I think you of course put your finger on exactly the point. You need economies of scale when you have a large population. This is an effect of thriving, rich country, allowing us to produce a certain number of offspring. And where are we now? We're up to 335 million. That's a big number. I'm writing about the turn of the 20th century, and there were 76 million of us. And even then, everyone was flocking to the city because that's where the opportunity was. And maybe also some of the the off-color aspects of the city that weren't available in the rural area unless you favored sheep.
So Sodom and Gomorrah, indeed. But so, okay, this is a phenomenon that's been around for a long time. You know, at one time in Jefferson's era, 95% of the American people were farmers. Fewer than 2% of the American people are farmers today. And so whatever Jefferson's agrarian dream was, it's over. Now, people of privilege, someone like you, presumably could go buy a little farmette somewhere on the outskirts of Seattle and have maybe a few chickens and maybe grow some tomatoes. That's what privileged people like to do. They like to go out and have a little agrarian plot, but that's not production of food.
No, and in fact, anyone who's actually worked on an actual farm, as I did for 6 years as a teenager, has no interest in. We had to, in order to feed 40 people every couple of months, we had to slaughter 200 chickens.
Oh my!
A couple of 800-pound steers, and about a dozen hogs. And believe me, that is one bloody business. It took me 6 months of shock and awe to reach the point where I could go from reducing a steer to a couple of beef halves on a hook to lunch and eat some beef. It's a shocking thing. You have to be re-socialized to do that. Remember, Jefferson had a whole group of slaves who did his work for him. He was a gentleman farmer himself, if you will. He focused on getting a good wine going in his vineyard while someone else raised his corn. So it's like the joke I remember hearing once when someone was watching video of John Kennedy in Ireland when he visited Ireland, and he looked so cool and clean and so forth. And the journalist who was following him said, well, yeah, someone else does his laundry. And that was true with Jefferson, too, let's face it. It was an ideal, I don't know, it's interesting to think where that idea comes from. The belief that if you have a piece of land, and if you have to be responsible for that land, that somehow it makes you a better person.
You've had many formative dynamics in your life, some of which we've talked about elsewhere and many of which we can read about in your books, but you've had a difficult beginning in your life, and you spent this time on this farm with other young men. What difference did it make in your life? Are you a better person for that agrarian episode and your later researches into farming in America?
You know, I think that the years I spent at the Andrew Drum Institute in Independence, Missouri, were the real basis, with some nice icing on top from 4 years at Yale, for my writing. It gave me a range of knowledge which was perhaps not sufficiently deep in any one subject, but I at least had a sense of where to go look for information. And I had a feeling for life, both rural and urban, because my previous wanderings had been kind of an urban Huck Finn, wandering around Kansas City, doing whatever the hell I wanted to do. You know, my brother, to give you a parallel example, people don't realize that the creeks and streams that used to flow over the land that became cities has by and large been channeled into giant conduits underground that also carry off the rainwater. All those grids at the corners of streets, down below, there's this 12-foot diameter pipe that runs for miles and flows the water off to some river somewhere. So my brother, who was a year and a half older than I, discovered those tunnels when we were wandering around Kansas City, this now in our stepmother years, so we had to stay away from home as much as possible. And he had just read Les Miserables, and he identified as Jean Valjean. And here were the catacombs of Paris, or whatever, the sewers of Paris. So he lived down there most of the time, wandering around the city. He would pop up in the middle of an intersection, out in the middle where there's one of those manhole covers that leads down to these giant pipes. He would pop up and a car would be coming, and the last minute he'd drop down. There was the ladder, and the car would roll over, and he had great fun. The one time I went down, I was terrified. There were some rats, and I started screaming bloody murder, and I got oh, you're such a big baby. But he helped me get out, and I never went back. I didn't want to. So,
this does not sound agrarian to me. This sounds urban.
Deserve it, but I'm saying
out of Victor Hugo. It's not a scene out of agrarian America. But what makes you, was it chores? Is it connected to the soil? Is it working with animals? Is it knowing the dynamics of life and death and so on? What's the thing that you get from that lifestyle?
I wrote about this in one of my books, because in my book, A Hole in the World, which is about my childhood. And the thing that was so powerful was the completion of the cycle of life. I mean, I'll never forget the first crop that we planted for ourselves was typically potatoes. So you would be given these little seed potatoes, which were cut quarters of potatoes with at least one eye, which is the place where the new plant starts, usually 2 or 3. They'd been soaked in potassium permanganate in order to kill a particular disease of potatoes. So they were purplish and weird, shrunken. You'd put this thing in a hole in the ground or in a line that we had dug with a rake and cover it over and pat it down. And then you'd keep watch over it all summer. This plant would come up and it would be there for a while, and then it would die. And then come fall, you would go down the row with a 1-horse plow, or someone would do it for you at that point, and turn over these rows. And there was this bounty of potatoes, big, beautiful brown or whatever yellow things. It was magic. I've never seen anything like it in my life. I couldn't believe it. But then we went from there to raising animals and taking care of animals. I never milked cows. I didn't like to milk cows for some reason, connected no doubt to my mother's death. But I did love shoveling the manure out of the barn. That suited my sort of cynical mood as a teenager. So I would volunteer to do this work, and the other boys would think I was crazy, but were happy that I would do it instead of they. I mean, they had to work 7 days a week milking cows. I just had to go in, scrape up a lot of manure, throw it into the manure pit, and leave. I was done for the day. So anyway, all of these things were a cycle. Even, and in a way, the most powerful experience was slaughtering an 800-pound steer. The farm manager shot it with a .22 rifle between the eyes, and it dropped like a stone. And then we had to take it apart, and it was a very bloody, smelly business, and then drag off the guts to be burned. And nevertheless, horrible as that would be to someone who wasn't conditioned to it as I came to be, it was part of our life. It was what we ate. We lived on it.
So you're connected to the cycles of life and to seasons and to growth and decay and harvest and life and slaughter, and you know where your meat has come from, and you know the psychic cost of that, having to watch that animal die and bleed out and so on. But there is a deep agrarian responsibility in that. And now with hog confinement and robotic farms and drones and so on, we've removed ourselves from the possibility of that sacred connection. And I think it shows. I think that Jefferson was right generally, if wrong locally. In other words, we can't all be farmers, but he understood that something in the spirit of humankind depends upon reestablishing our connectivity to things that are deeper and more fundamental than ourselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's very much, the Drum Institute was pre-psychology. It was founded back in the 1920s, and there was no what they would have called nonsense about sitting and talking to a psychologist. But the experience of the cycle of the natural world, the experience of taking care of animals and then later slaughtering them, but not always. I mean, there were sheep and so forth. So the experience of living in the real world, if you will, was healing in a deep, deep way.
And you were healed by this in part.
I was in part, absolutely. And it also gave me a sense that has, I hope, infused most of my writing of that kind of what that world is and what it means. I read an essay once about touring a hog slaughterhouse in Iowa, and it's a pretty bloody story, needless to say, but it ends up with the sentence something like this, which is why in the old days people closed their eyes and bowed their heads before they picked up their forks, which, I mean, you just can't walk away from the natural world with a sense of, oh, that's nothing. And I think right now, given the increasing industrialization of the raising animals, things are going to have to change. People are beginning to be aware of this. I'm not cynical about killing animals. I understand the point of it. I understand why we do it, and I'm not opposed to it. But I can see why people ultimately, those same city people who are supposedly so corrupt, are in fact so tender about animals that they'd like to find some other way to make their food.
So, Richard, we need to take a short break. Our final one. When we come back, I want to continue this very remarkable conversation about the agrarian and rural v. urban, coastal v. inland, and what's happening to the heartland of America and how it relates to our troubled national politics. This is a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking with my friend Richard Rhodes, and what a great thing. You know, I read one of your essays not long ago, about a year ago. I'd known your work, of course, and I'm a deep admirer of your work. I've read, almost all of your many books on the nuclear question. It's not just the two giants, there are others. For the moment, we're talking about the agrarian and the heartland, and the hollowing out of America, of the heartland of America, is deeply troubling to me because, the food's still in the stores. We're always going to have food, unless there's a worldwide economic or environmental collapse. But the way we produce our food now has dehumanized it to a very considerable degree. And, I've slaughtered a couple of bison and I've slaughtered a couple of hogs. And as you say, it's a bloody awful business. And when you're done with that, there's a kind of a quietness. You don't really start shouting, and there's a sort of solemnity to this grave thing that you have to do, and to watch an animal bleed out. And then with the bison, it's on the ground and its muscles continue to quiver for upwards of an hour while you're cutting it apart. It's an amazing experience. But when I went to a slaughterhouse in Nebraska for cattle, I didn't eat meat for 6 months after that. And I couldn't get the stench out of my nostrils. That there's something about that model of it that changes the equation fundamentally. And as you say, we have a mass population, so you're going to have mass factory food production, but that's not the same as the farm with some neighbors around killing that hog and butchering it and sharing out that meat.
That's true. It's not the same. And to the extent that mass production, the numbers of animals that are slaughtered every year in this country range toward 80 billion. I just saw the number the other day and I was shocked. That's probably mostly chickens, because that's one of our main sources of meat in the United States and elsewhere in the world. But the way that's done, if people saw it, they would never eat these meats again.
So Michael Pollan has written about all of this. I'm an admirer of his work, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and The Botany of Desire, and so on. And he has a famous chapter on corn, and how corn is really an insane thing to grow in any level. But of course, we have gigantic and expanding corn horizons as they move west with genetically modified seed that's drought resistant and so on. But be that as it may, his concern is that we have an economically unsustainable food supply system. We also have an environmentally unsustainable food supply system, but that's not where you and I are today. We're letting Jefferson sort of guide us as our muse here. We also have a morally unsustainable food delivery system. And when I see a hog confinement factory, and for those that don't know, this is like putting 5,000 hogs in a small factory with concrete, and they literally move almost not at all in the whole course of their lives, and chickens and turkeys too. When I see that, I always say, we better hope there's no karma.
Oh, yeah.
We better hope there's no karma. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and I really want to say this carefully. Having grown up on a farm and done these things and written about them even at the industrial scale, visiting that slaughterhouse in Iowa and so forth, I feel no judgment at all about the people who operate these things. It's just part of a system. It's a kind of a system. There is a kind of violence that's described by those who write about violence as systemic violence. violence that exists because it's built into the way things are organized.
I want to get back to the plight of rural America. So I wrote a book a few years ago. It's my latest book. It's called The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota. And I'd like you to take a look at it, and then we could talk about it. Because I talked about the plight of rural America in it. And a couple of things. First of all, I think that the character of the people of North Dakota was created by their agrarian roots. Chores, neighborly responsibility, humility, postponement of gratifications, frugality in their financial lives, independence of government and handouts and so on. And that this really shows in the character of North Dakota. But we're no longer an agrarian people. Now we're an agri-production people, and most North Dakotans live in towns or cities. And so how do you maintain that ethos that is so valuable? I mean, we're not the best poets in the world. We're not the best ballet dancers. We're not the best orchestras or saxophone players. But we are extraordinary people in terms of their basic decencies and capacity for community. God-fearing, tax-paying, law-abiding, unassuming Americans. I love that. How do you sustain it when that system, that paradigm that produces that character, which admittedly was extremely hard labor, early mornings, lots of chores. We should not over-romanticize rural life, but how do you sustain and maintain that character when you become just another suburb of Minnesota, of St. Paul or Minneapolis, or another suburb of Seattle? And I don't know the answer to this. And the sentence in my book that was the hardest sentence I ever pushed return on was this sentence: "It is not clear that the problems of rural America can be solved." And it broke my heart to push return, but I have no answer. So do you have an answer? Is there any way that you can foresee, I know you like a techno fix, is there any way that you can foresee a renewal of rural America and a repopulation of the heartland?
No. In fact, I think that you again put your finger on the fundamental problem that's led people to this false god with his duck-tailed hair and his artificial tan. I mean, he's the music man, right? He comes to town and it's going to make it rain. It's an absolute mystery to me why those good God-fearing people you're talking about, some of them, not all of them, would turn to such a figure. And the other thing that, and this is connected to it, and I'm not sure how, is the rise of evangelical Christianity of a particularly vicious kind, unfortunately, in rural America as well. It looks like people who are desperate for solutions to the very problem you're raising. And they've turned temporarily to false gods because they've come in and said, we got it, try this. I hope this phase in American life is going to end soon.
But Richard Rhodes, let me make the case for these people. Even though I disagree with their politics in large part, they're watching the way of life that they grew up in disappear. They're seeing that the triumph of Costco over everything is going to hollow out what's left of rural America and Walmart and so on and so forth. They have been systematically ignored by Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton and so on, that they can't get the attention of that crowd, the Martha's Vineyard crowd, that is no longer FDR's party, but something quite different now. They feel like no one's listening and that their way of life is in actual danger. And along comes somebody, call him what you like, who says, I hear you, I'm going to help you, I understand your plight. I don't think he has delivered, but that's not the question. The appeal of Donald Trump in rural life is that he's not another Ivy League think tank person who goes to Whole Foods and sneers at people who go to rural cafes. That the political genius of Donald Trump was that he discerned this and he tapped it, and it took him into power, and it may take him again. And until the Democrats realize that they have to focus on the whole country and not just the elite coasts and the great city-states like Chicago or St. Louis, they cannot restore faith. And so, What's the Matter with Kansas, that great book, which says that the rural people get schnookered every time. by Republican demagogues who say it's all about same-sex marriage or it's all about LGBTQ or transgender, and then they vote against their own economic self-interest, which I think is largely true. But at least Donald Trump hearkened to their pain and said, I hear you, and somebody finally has come to listen.
Again and again, as we've discussed this, we come back to the same thing, which is the change in scale. The change in scale, which eventually becomes not quantitative, but qualitative. That's something that's a standard phenomenon throughout, as far as I know, the entire universe. But when it happens, there's always a residue of people who are left behind.
And are desperate and angry and filled with rage and frustration.
Yeah, exactly. And as it happens, because of the way our political system is set up, they have an unusual amount of power, considering the small numbers involved. In the long run, I'm afraid the scale is going to determine what happens. The fact is, rural people, for all their virtues, are not more virtuous than people in the city. They may think they are. The time will come, I think, when this will balance out. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be in 2050 when 70% of the population lives in cities. In the meantime, the farm life, as you say, is going robotic, if you will.
It's very much robotic, but let me counter just slightly. I mean, there's a pretty vibrant CSA movement, with these small truck farmers who provide boxes of food for people who subscribe. I have friends in North Dakota who do harvest dinners, and people flock to them. In other words, it's not all bad news that there is a pretty vibrant minority movement in the country for people to know where their food came from and to insist that it be humanely grown, and to vote against, with their purchases, the mass production system of food. I don't know how big that phenomenon is. It doesn't feel very big to me. I think most Americans are at Walmart buying 6 pounds of hamburger, but I think that there's hope in that. And what my problem is about policy, Richard, because the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, if it wished to, could quite easily provide a range of incentives for that sort of non-traditional agriculture. Instead, they celebrate the most prosperous and innovative and technologically advanced agri-producers. So these are policy questions in addition to other things. And we could, in France, as you know, there are dozens, scores, hundreds of small farms that are 5 acres, 22 acres, 117 hectares. And the government policy in France is to protect that kind of agriculture. And every French person is well fed. In fact, I may say better fed than we are, because their cheese is better, their bread is better, their food is less chemically tainted. So these are policy questions, and we've just decided that this is going to be our American policy because we love capitalism and big profits and so on. But we could turn this around somewhat if we wish to, couldn't we?
We could certainly have more of what you're talking about. And to some extent, that's been happening. It's now possible to buy a good loaf of bread in my local store here in Seattle. I mean, a really good loaf of bread. But
you're in Seattle. You're not in Omaha, and you're not in Bismarck, and you're not in Richmond.
I'll bet you can find a good loaf of bread in Omaha. I bet you can. If not now, 10 years from now. Because Americans are developing their palate, let's face it. We're traveling more. We're going to France. We're coming home and saying, why don't we have this soft, gooey bread? Can't we have some good, crunchy bread? And so on. It is happening, but it's a phenomenon to some degree of education and all of that these things go on. I think these things, this also is a phenomenon of prosperity. People who have more free income can actually go to these places and widen their horizon and so forth. So I see these things sort of spreading out from, it used to be that far away was a full-scale farm from a city. And then you got closer in, you got dairy farms, because it was easier to run those and sell the milk in town. And then you got closer in and it was truck farms. And I think we'll keep going. But it's a matter primarily of prosperity and education and travel and widening horizons. All the things that happen in cities that people in the country think are kind of suspicious.
This political divide that's roiling America and disintegrating America is largely coastal v. heartland, urban v. rural, Whole Foods v. Cracker Barrel. These are cultural tokens, and you see them in Congress. You see them in our national political rhetoric. there is this quarrel, this deep, deep quarrel going on between Lee Greenwood's America and Nancy Pelosi's America. The divide is getting more pronounced, and the mutual distrust is higher. And yet, if you look at the map the day after the election, and if you point to the red counties, not the red votes, but the red counties, the United States is overwhelmingly red. I mean, profoundly, overwhelmingly red, including central and eastern Washington, where you live. The blue is the coast and these city-states like Chicago and so on. So we have this really deep, weird mismatch between the population centers, which are not in the heartland, and then this vast heartland, which has been neglected. Rural health is poor, rural diets are poor, rural access to the fruits of government are poor. And this has to be addressed by both parties, or this problem will become, I think, a fundamental American crisis. It may already be.
I think it is. I mean, we certainly can see the division between the two sides and the two candidates right now for president. Kamala Harris certainly represents the what you would call the Martha's Vineyard version of the world.
San Francisco, that term is used as a term of abuse for her.
Right, yes.
Are you a fan of Wendell Berry's work at all?
As much as I know it, I don't know it very well.
He has a book called The Unsettling of America, Richard, which I heartily recommend. It's called The Unsettling of America. It was written 35 years ago, but he's an amazing man. I really recommend him to all of our listeners and to you. I'm surprised that there's any book in America that you haven't put your finger on at one time or another. But he says The Unsettling of America is the hollowing out of rural ritual and rural sacredness.
Yeah, I feel as if with guys like him and many others who write about rural America that I've already been there myself. And whatever they see can't be that different from what I saw.
Of course, yeah.
I tend to read books about urban things, war, that sort of thing. There I'm still learning, perhaps, although I did spend my time wandering around the town. So I got a good taste of both sides, strangely enough, in my childhood.
One of my goals is to get you to Vail, Colorado, but another now, today, is to get you to Omaha. And I think we should meet in Omaha on kind of a grail quest for the perfect loaf of bread.
I used to go to Omaha all the time with my second wife because her family were gamblers. We used to go to the horse races. That was great fun. Now that's another side of America that unfortunately is fading away too, I think, a bit. Well, maybe not.
Richard Rhodes, we're out of time, but let me ask you this. Recommend a couple of your books that address some of this at some level. I know you have 3 or 4 that could pertain.
Well, I think in terms of what I talked about of my own childhood, my book is called A Hole in the World, Hole. And I have a book called The Inland Ground, my first book, which is about all sorts of aspects of Midwestern life. There's another book later, which is Farm. It's just called Farm, which was that 9 months I spent working with a Missouri farmer back in the late 1980s.
My reading of America, Richard, is that there's a deep spiritual malaise in the country.
Yeah.
One expression of which is in our troubled politics, but that's not really where it's at. It's deeper. And that until we turn and address this, look in this mirror and say, why aren't we happy? Because we're surrounded by stuff. We're just buried in stuff. We have access. We're the richest, most consumerist, most materialistic, most opulent people who ever walked on the face of the earth, and yet we're not happy. And people, Thoreau was right. The mass of men are leading lives of quiet and maybe not so quiet desperation. And so we have to address this issue. And I wish you were 35 years old and you would now write 3 or 4 books on this subject because it's so important.
So do I. 35 years particularly. Yes, well, I agree. I don't think that book's been written yet either.
No, it needs to be written. And you would be the perfect position to do it. So you've got to take care of your health, get plenty of exercise, eat only organic food. My friend, thank you. Let's meet again soon and talk about where the world is in 2025 with respect to the nuclear genie that was unleashed on July 16th, 1945 at Alamogordo.
Very important subject, and it has not been assessed the way it should be today.
We'll do that in a couple of weeks. I've been talking with my dear friend Richard Rhodes. What a joy. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.